So in this session, we're going to talk about building a graphical user interface, or GUI, inside of Java. Now, in Java, there's two ways to deal with GUIs. The old-fashioned way is something called the Abstract Windowing Toolkit. And this really isn't used all that often anymore, but it's important to mention it because it's the foundation of how some of this stuff was set up. The way it worked was your Java application wouldn't actually draw anything itself. It would plug into your operating system's behind-the-scenes GUI drawing capabilities. So if you're on a Windows machine, you'd be using Windows. If you're on a Mac, it'd be using Mac. A Unix machine, you'd be using Unix to be able to draw the displays. It worked okay. The problem was when you switch the application to different machines, it would look different. It might behave a little differently. And so Java built their own version of all the windowing technology called Swing. It's a consistent look and feel across all platforms. It gives that write once, run anywhere feel back to Java. And the way it does that is by giving you a number of components. And so when we're building a GUI, there's a couple things we want to be aware of. There's the display elements, which is the screens that go up and how we put those screens together, and the input elements that we're going to be talking about. And then there's the user interactions, and that's largely coming down to keyboard and mouse gestures that are going to be happening. So as we go and talk about screens, we're going to see how do we lay out screens, how do we build windows and dialog boxes and all this sort of stuff. When we're talking about input elements, it's all the standard stuff your user would interact with, and your text boxes and your buttons and your radio buttons and the drop downs and the sliders and all the stuff you'd see on a screen to display, tables, things like that. The user interactions, as we said, within the mouse, you move your mouse, you click your mouse, you drag and drop. All those actions will come up. We'll discuss those later on in a different video. As well as the keyboard gestures, is where you press keys and release keys and all the things you can do with that. And Java has all these things baked in, so you can have fully functional GUIs. Now, the way this works is these pieces come together through this inheritance hierarchy. At the top, we have this thing called a container, which actually harkens back to AWT. And then past that, you see all these J things. So a J component, that's a swing thing. A J text component, that's the start of a bunch of things that do text, like a text field or a password field. We can see those down here in the middle. And then the text areas and editor panes and all these things work together and they get thrown onto a screen. So these are all classes provided for you in your basic Java kit that comes automatically with the language, and you can go and use these and draw with these things, and you can have display elements as well as input elements. The JTables we mentioned before, that's a display element to display a bunch of data on a screen, and really helpful for displaying a lot of data. We also have a bunch of buttons out there, a highly interactive thing, and I just want to point out here, they also are components. And they have this thing called an abstract button, has the idea of something being pushed. And then you have on the left here, you have your J button, which is the thing you would be pressing in order to have a button press. But you also have things like menu items, which are kind of buttons. If you maybe not think of it that way, but when I drop down, I click something, it's like clicking a button. Button disappears, but it's a button. And then checkboxes and radio buttons are buttons with state. I check them, they're on, they're off, or the different ones are on. I can select different one that is going to be on. So these are all types of buttons, and they can be used somewhat interchangeably. So to draw a screen in Java, we'll get examples of that as we go. We'll build code in later sessions. We want to consider a couple things. First, what goes onto the screen? Do we want text? Do we want buttons? Do we want pictures? Do we want drop-downs and sliders and all that sort of stuff? And then, where do each of them go? And we can control all that within our source code. But beyond that, we also want to consider is how big is that thing going to be? Some apps are built to be one fixed size, but most apps want to be able to change the size of elements on the screen as the screen size changes. So we have to consider dynamics inside of drawing our screen, not just a one-time drawing. And so one way we can structure everything, and this is actually an old Microsoft game, a little card game that was out there called Golf, is it did absolute sizing. It basically set the screen size and your cards were up in the left and your deal pile was down to the right. And if you tried to make the window size smaller, what ended up happening was those cards on the bottom right couldn't be seen anymore. They didn't change their position. They didn't stay relative. And even though you can see in this bottom picture here, there's plenty of space for the cards, they don't move. They're hidden. They're still down here at the bottom where we can't see them, as you can see up above. And so it's a trade-off. On one hand, doing absolute positioning is easier to get the screen built the first time. But it's only going to work for that one screen size. If it gets bigger, things will be too small. If it gets smaller, things will be disappearing or not showing anymore. And so within Java, we have the capability of managing that automatically using something called a layout manager. The layout manager's job is to determine the size and the placement on the screen of each one of the items. And so like our marching band here, each one has their position, but they have to scale their position based off of the size of the field they're performing on. So if they're on a football field, they have to be really far apart to be able to fill up that space. If they move inside to the basketball court, they got to be much closer together. So they basically, I mean, the people don't get bigger themselves, but that didn't happen there, but they know where they're going to be based off of the size and space of the place, and that's managed by the layout manager. Our items aren't really individually smart like a marching band would be. It's just an analogy. But the layout manager tells them where to stand, essentially. So there's a couple of default layout managers in Java, one of them being called the flow layout. The flow layout element is basically like typing on a keyboard. I put my first item down, a button in this case, it's the top left. Put the next one down, it goes left to right inside of there. When it gets to the end of the row, it goes down to the next row, and it keeps using up space, left to right, and then top to bottom as it keeps going. That's not actually a keyboard. It could be anything. It could be a button, it could be a text box, it could be a picture, it could be any of these elements inside of there, but that's the way it lays things out. So an alternative to that is the border layout. The border layout is saying, hey, I have 5 spaces in which you can put whatever components you want to. So the 5 regions are north, south, east, west, and center. And so these, basically you can put one item in each one of these things. So if I was doing buttons, I would have one button in each one of these places. If I wanted to do text, I could have one text box in each one of these places. And there's ways I can put these things together to make it more robust, as we'll see in a second. But that's the fundamentals of this layout. Another one we can talk about is the grid layout, which basically says I have a grid of some number of rows, some number of columns. And each row is, well, each column, I should say, is in this case 1/3 or 1/4 or 1/5 or whatever, however many columns there are, the width of this space. And then each row is 1 fraction, in this case 1/4 of the height of the space. And they're all the same size with height as every other cell inside of there, though they're not squares. They can be rectangles if it's wider or taller. And I fill these again one at a time, and each one has one element inside of it. So you can do like a telephone keypad very easily on something like this. It's kind of what it looks like, but you can use it in other interesting ways as well. And so as I said, the way we do this is we piece together these displays. This big complicated display you can see behind the boxes there is made of basically these 3 elements inside there. So I have a border layout as the big yellow one on the outside here. And so I have a top, a north, a south, and a center. I don't have to have east and west. I didn't fill them, so they're just not showing up inside of here. And then inside that border layout, the south, you can see, has a flow layout with 3 buttons inside of it. And they're centered inside of there. So I have one element, which is another panel with 3 buttons inside of it. The top one, again, another flow layout. This one's left justified instead of centered. Inside of there, then I have another border layout. It has a top section, as you can see in the orange dotted lines inside of here, and a bottom section. And there's panels inside of that. And then in the north, I have a grid layout, perhaps. And then I have maybe a 4 or 2 grid layout. It doesn't matter. I mean, there's different ways I could split it up. And then inside, I have another border layout. The top, the middle, the bottom inside of there. And then so on and so on and so on. I can just keep creating little panels with these intricate little pieces. So this is the fundamentals, and we'll see this in code. This is all something we can do with just text, just plain old source code, or there's actually tools available to help us set this stuff up as well. But this is the basic way we build our GUIs. We basically piece them together from a bunch of little pieces onto panels, just like I'm cutting out a collage. I take something, I paste on a piece of paper, and I take those pieces of paper and I paste them together. That's how we build GUIs in Java.